All right, everyone. This is our Anatomy and Physiology I, Dr. Granier, the St. Louis Meramec Campus, Community College, and we are taking off with the last objective of the Chapter 1, which is to look at the body cavities and the sectioning of the body and being able to identify them. So a lot of this material will be stuff we do in lab and review in lab, but I'm going to give a quick little lecture over them to make sure everyone comes prepared for lab. Now, when we look at the body cavities and sectioning of the body, that is a broad classification of a material you need to know. So you need to know anatomical terms to be able to then effectively label with the right terminology, the right buzzword. It's kind of like we use a lot of slang and nicknames for things, but you need to learn the correct anatomical terminology. And my husband, when he went through med school, said that because many things are rooted in Latin, he really got to utilize that he took Latin in college as a foreign language, and it helped him. Latin is a dead language. It doesn't get spoken, so most of us do not know Latin, but we actually do have a rich Latin influence on English and the Romance languages. So you may find that some of the words and terms we use to describe things are very closely related to their slang or their nickname because it's, again, all rooted in Latin. We're going to go through the body cavities, we're going to go through the sectional planes, and then the key thing that you need to learn for the body cavities is going to be the membranes that are lining those cavities. And we're going to hit that in A&P2, we're going to hit that in multiple organ systems where the outermost layer of the organ and some of the different organs in an organ system are going to be that membrane lining some of these body cavities. So it's important that you learn them now so that way when you get to them in other organ systems you've got a leg up on it. Okay? Now, anatomical terms. So again, you're learning a new language. So you're learning the vocabulary to describe places and parts and pieces of the body. So there are superficial anatomy terms you have to learn. So instead of saying the shoulder might be referring to the bone poking out on the scapula, which is known as the acromial process. So it's the acromium feature of the shoulder. So it's getting a little bit more specific. Why do we make you memorize these terms? One, it's easy lab practical questions of identify indicated anatomical feature. Two, the names of bone markings, the names of blood vessels, the names of ligaments, the names of tendons, the names of lymphatic vessels, the names in your records that you are going to see for note-taking if you're going into medical records that doctors and nurses use are going to speak in this language. So it's important that you learn the language because if you're a nurse, then you know which vessel or which nerve or which area of the body you're going to be conducting the surgery or messing with. If you're writing the, you're the transcriber or you're the note taker or you're the medical technician that writes notes or transcribes notes into the written or the medical records, you need to be able to then know which part of the body they're kind of talking to. It's important so that way you can see if things make sense to stay in the same area of the body when they give their notes to you. All right, so that is why we make you learn superficial anatomy. It's learning the language. So when you go into the military, you have to learn that the head is the name for the bathroom. You learn the real names for what they call the right or the left part of a ship. This is kind of that kind of thing. If you're going into a world of medicine where the human body is going to be studied or manipulated or utilized, you need to learn the correct universal anatomical language. When you listen to people on YouTube that come from England or India, they might pronounce things and spell things a little differently, and that's okay. The main takeaway is learn to spell everything as your book spells it, because as long as it's spelled a certain way in your book, that is going to be the way that I will accept on your lab exams or your written part of any material in this class. Okay? Now, To give us a framework that is universally accepted as the universal starting point, all right, we are going to learn things from anatomical position. An anatomical position is we assume that we are always referring to a person standing up, hands by their side, palms facing forward, okay? Now, many people can't walk anymore, so it might be that you have to then refer to the person or you're not going to do surgery on someone awake, alert, and standing. So you might want to then make reference that we are going to do the surgery in the supine or the prone position, and all of our references for location and feature and action that occurs will be because the person is a supine or prone position. All right, and it's a good way then to set up when you start maybe describing what you're doing or where you're going or what part of the body you're working on, that you identify as the person in anatomical position, is the person supine, prone, or holding a different body position for the test or for the procedure. All right. Again, our anatomical regions, we can describe things in terms of the body regions. For the belly, which has a large portion of the digestive tract, we might refer to things in the abdominal pelvic quadrants, so the 4 quadrants, or more specifically, one of the 9 regions. So it's whether you make the abdominal pelvic area into a 4-corner or you make it into a tic-tac-toe board. Right? And when you start referring to things directionally, if something is above or below, we don't quite use that terminology because, again, above and below can be relative to the anatomical supine or prone position. So we will see that we have to, again, learn correct directional terms to use that better apply to is something on the surface, is something located internally, is something always going to be superior no matter which position it is, prone, supine, or anatomical, or is that potential area of the body movable such that you have to use proximal distal, okay? So this picture from your book with the anatomical landmarks, it's also the anatomical landmarks listed in your lab manual, are going to be expected of you to learn the correct spelling, the correct location, and the application of them. So you will see that I may give you the matching questions where I ask you on one side the anatomical term, the bold term, and I ask you to match it to its correct kind of slang nickname term. You might see that on the lab exam I label on the little models we have with stickies an area of the body, and I ask you to indicate the specific anatomical term for that feature or that area. So these are ones that you want to practice writing out, practice spelling. And if you are ever going to be in a practical session that you would have to respond, you might want to listen to people say them so you can correctly pronounce them. Okay? And again, because you're in America, you want to try to find American speaking, not necessarily English or British folks, because they may pronounce things a little different. For your abdominal pelvic quadrants, again, you divide the belly into 4 parts, and they get their name somewhat by location. Upper right, upper left, lower right. And you hear like, you know, I have pain in the lower left quadrant. You'll see that is written sometimes in notes when people describe where their pain is. And because of the pain located in a certain region and because of the way we know the body is organized, they eliminate certain issues. So if I say my pain is upper right, I know they might have gallbladder, gallstones, liver pain, versus if I know it's lower right quadrant, I might think, well, maybe there's an appendix issue. Maybe there's some type of colon problem with the ascending colon or something like that. Okay? Now, there's still a lot of organs. Again, I listed quite a few potential issues. So if you want to get more specific, or if you're trying to do maybe a small incision, you might find you want to be in a smaller region. And so that's why you can use the tic-tac-toe board and start to get a little bit more specifically into an area of the body. Now, I do expect you to learn all of these quadrants and regions by name. Okay? And when you look at the quadrants, they're pretty easy to learn because you're saying by direction. Left, right, left, up, you know, up, low, up, down kind of thing. The regions, the 9 abdominal regions, the names that are given, if you don't know the root word, if you don't know those Latin backgrounds, might be a little bit more challenging. So when you look at that, there's a right and left hypochondriatic region. Hypo, because we have learned in our ACT and SAT prep classes, typically means below. So hypo usually means low or below, and so hypo is telling you something below or lower. Chondriatic relates to chondrocytes, and chondrocytes are cartilage cells that are located in cartilage. And in the rib cage area, we have costal cartilage. So what this name is somewhat telling you is this region is going to be below the cartilage connecting ribs to sternum. So now that you look at it, hypochondriatic region, you should be able to say, oh yeah, that makes sense. All right, lumbar is because of the area of the spine, that's the lumbar region. And inguinal is because we have the inguinal ligaments, we have that area of the body related to that feature, okay? Gastric, you're going to see epi is going to mean outside, around, above, and hypo, again, lower, below. So epigastric means it's kind of in the higher, around, superior, bigger, higher, outside areas of the stomach, of the GI tract, the gastric juices being produced. And hypogastric is a name to say below the stomach, below the major pieces and parts that produce gastric juices and part of the digestive tract. You can also say that hypogastric is the pubic region because it's closest to the pubic symphysis. It's closest to the pubic area, anatomically speaking, of the body. Umbilical should make sense because that's where the umbilical cord connected. It's usually where the belly button is located. So now that you understand that Latin background of these words, maybe it then helps you learn the 9 regions. Okay, so how am I going to test this? I am going to typically combine directional terms with the 9 abdominal regions. So I might ask you, the umbilical region is inferior to the blank. And what I'm asking you to tell me is the umbilical region is inferior to the epigastric region. The left lumbar region is lateral to the blank. The left lumbar region would be lateral or kind of closer to the margins of the body related to the umbilical because the umbilical is on the medial, the middle, the midline. Right? So you'll see I kind of like to use both of those terms, sometimes combine those two concepts to ask a few questions on both lab and lecture. Right? Again, directional terminology. In the human body, our main framework is to say we're in anatomical position. Okay? So when we're in anatomical position, if things are towards the head, we tend to say things are towards the cranial area of the body. If things are towards the tail, the tailbone region, you are going to say the things are going to rely on the caudal region. In humans, we like to use anterior and posterior. So if things tend to be towards the front of the body, we would say things are on the anterior part of the body. If things are towards the back, we tend to say posterior. Now, ventral and dorsal are terminology we use in animal models, more so in humans. However, many people that study the nervous system cannot get humans to volunteer to let them donate pieces and parts of their brains while they're still alive. So a lot of our research done in the nervous system is done in animal models. Therefore, to kind of translate what goes on in an animal model to the human, ventral means the anterior part of the animal when it's standing on all fours, which is its anatomical position. The ventral is the part of the body from the spinal cord facing down, and then the dorsal is everything, again, from an animal model perspective, that's kind of towards the posterior, pointing up and back when they're standing in anatomical position. So For your nervous system, when you look at labeled spinal cords, labeled pieces of brain and nerves, you might see that there's a more acceptable way to say ventral dorsal there, whereas in most of your other organ systems they say anterior and posterior. It is perfectly correct to use them interchangeably in this class, but if you go on to more of animal work, to do veterinary work, you're going to find a tendency to stay in the ventral dorsal terminology if you are dividing the body into front and back pieces, and if you tend to stay more in human, you're going to stay more with the anterior posterior terminology. Okay? If things in anatomical position are towards the head, another thing you can say, if it's more towards the top of the body, is it's superior. If it's more towards the bottom parts of the body, it can be inferior. Now, inferior and superior work great if you are in anatomical position and you refer to things that are on the what's known as the axial skeleton or main axis of the body. Unfortunately, our arms and our legs are not part of the axial skeleton, and they are not on the main axis of the body, and they can rotate and change. So I can have my arms by my sides, I can have my arms out pointing, you know, to landmarks in front or behind or to the side of me, or I can reach my arms over my head and stretch them to the sky. My legs, I can't quite make them stretch to the sky anymore, but my legs, I can kick up my legs in front of me, I can kick my leg behind me, I can kick my leg outward. So my arms and legs are what's known as part of my appendicular skeleton. They are connected to the axis, but they have more freedom of movement with those two main hip and shoulder joints, and they can move their orientation to where the wrist and the fingers are not always inferior to my head. They can be level with my head if I put my arms out in front of me or to the side, or they can be above my head at times. So when we start talking about superior, inferior, you always use superior, inferior when you're referring to the main axis of the body, so something from tailbone up to the crown. You use proximal and distal when you want to talk about the appendicular skeleton. So we are going to always refer to things as either closer to the midline of the body or further away from the midline of the body. So proximal means it's closer to that connecting joint, or distal means it's further away from that connecting joint. So my fingers, while they might sometimes be inferior to my head, they are always, always further away from the hip or shoulder joint than the elbow. So the fingers are always going to be distal, all right, to my elbow. My elbow is always a little bit closer to the main attachment part, a little bit closer to those shoulder joints. So my elbows are always going to be proximal to my fingers. And that doesn't matter if my hands are by my side, if my hands are out, or if my hands are reaching up overhead. The elbow is distal to the shoulder. The elbow is proximal to the fingers. The fingers are distal to the elbow or to the shoulder. The wrist is proximal to the fingers. So depending upon how you say it, you then use proximal and distal. All right? For right, left, and medial and lateral, we run into problems there as well. If we cut the body in half on the sagittal plane, we divide the body into equal right and left pieces and parts. And that's okay because we have a right arm and a right leg and a left arm and a left leg. But when you start looking on the arm and legs, we have a big toe on each foot, and we have a little toe on each foot, and we have a big thumb on each foot and a little pinky finger on each foot. We have a part of the elbow that points out away from the body and a part of the elbow that points towards the body when you stand in anatomical position. We have a knee, a part of the knee that points out. We have a part of the knee that points in. And if you go with right and left consistently over and over again, if I want to refer to my thumb on my right hand, I could say my right thumb of my right hand. And I can say my right pinky finger of my left, or my right pinky finger of my right hand. And that doesn't get too confusing. But if we tried to do that with the elbow, there's the right part of the right elbow and the left part of the left elbow, you can start to get confused. And we don't want surgeons to be confused when they're told to go to the right part of the right elbow. That can be too confusing, and they might accidentally start cutting on the left elbow. All right? So instead of doing right, right, left, and left, left, right, and we can start to refer to things in anatomical position as they are closer to midline or they are further away from midline. And so in saying that, the thumb, when we're standing in anatomical positions with palm facing forward, the thumbs are always pointing out away from the body. So the thumbs are always on the lateral portion of the arms. And therefore, taking that further, the elbow has a lateral side and a medial side. And so instead of writing the right part of the elbow, you can put the medial portion of the right elbow or the lateral portion of the right elbow. And using those terms in that manner, in some ways, clarifies better for the surgeon which part to start cutting on. So in our knees, again, when we're standing in anatomical position, there is always going to be the part that faces towards midline, is closer to midline, is the medial portion of the knee joint, and the part that's outward and away is going to be lateral. So instead of saying the right knee or the left right knee, you can say the medial right knee, the lateral part of the right knee. Okay? And that the hard part for students is to know when to say medial lateral, when to say proximal distal, when to say right left, when to say superior and inferior. Right? And in order to understand that, again, you have to somewhat learn what your sectional planes are. So in physics, you talk about there are 3 planes. There's an X, a Y, and a Z plane. Well, if we cut the body along those planes, if we cut along the X plane, we are going to be cutting the body into front and back pieces. And that X plane is known as your coronal or your frontal plane. And it gives us a picture where you should see something towards the anterior or towards the posterior, towards the ventral or towards the dorsal parts of the body. If we want to cut things in the Y plane, we tend to cut things along the sagittal plane. And that can give us a right and a left. So when it's directly on midline, we get the mid-sagittal plane. So if I want to cut my heart into atria and ventricles, right and left pieces, I have to cut on a sagittal plane. And I'm not cutting on a mid-sagittal plane because the heart is not on the midline of the body. All right? If I want to cut so that way I get a top and bottom, I am going to cut on the transverse plane. And the transverse plane, again, if you cut on the axis of the body or along the spinal cord, you can say something is above and below, so superior and inferior. If you cut on the sagittal, if you cut on the transverse plane on your arm or your leg, you would say sections are proximal or distal. So when I cut, let's say I cut my arm at the elbow and I give myself a stump, the hand and the lower portion of the arm that makes one segment that I now can section further is going to be my proximal sections, my distal sections, whereas what I section that gets closer to the shoulder joint will be my proximal section. Okay? For those of you that want to go into imaging for echocardiograms, x-rays, you want to learn your planes because when an order comes in, to be able to see, like let's say the ankle joint, they want to see all the different ligaments, you might have to take a view that gives you a picture in the sagittal plane, that gives you a picture in the frontal plane, and then the transverse plane. And so being able to put the joint in the right positioning to take those pictures is going to be part of what you focus and strengthen to be able to give the right view so tears, damage can be seen in a specific location of the body to a specific joint or specific place. Okay? All right, the last part of the body cavities, again, is that our human body does separate certain areas of the body into specific places. So the brain and the spinal cord are separated to somewhat better protect them. So if something happens to the heart or lungs, the brain and the spinal cord are insulated and a little bit more protected from that. The brain is pretty important. That's why it's separated. The heart and the lungs are pretty vital organs. So while they're co-located in the thoracic cage, they are still separated from the reproductive organs, which could be torn out and the organism could survive. They are separated from the kidneys and from some of the digestive organs, which again could be cut into smaller pieces and portions, and the organism could survive with less of it. But with that being said, you know, the body does then divide things into better kind of compartmentalize and protect them. And so when we look at our cavities, most of our cavities are divided into what's located on the front of the body when we make a coronal or frontal plane cut, and those are known as the ventral cavities. And then the cavities that are located on the back of the body would be the dorsal cavities. The dorsal cavities are the brain and the spinal cord. And so the skull, even though you technically cut the skull with a coronal cut, we think of the brain encased in the skull in the cranial cavity as part of the dorsal system, and the spinal cavity that the spine lives in, your spinal cord lives in, is the spinal cavity. The ventral cavities are divided by the diaphragm. So everything that's above the diaphragm encased in your rib cage is going to be your thoracic cage in your thoracic cavity, and then everything from the diaphragm down to the pelvic floor is going to be the abdominal pelvic cavity. All right? Now, inside the thoracic cavity, we are going to have the lungs, a right and a left lung, and we're going to have the heart. We're going to have an esophagus. We're going to have some of the aorta and the inferior and superior vena cava, all located in that space. The lungs are moving. They're inflating and deflating, and the heart is moving. It's increasing in size with filling and decreasing in size with squeeze and pushing the blood out. So within the thoracic cavity, we are going to see that special membranes are going to, in some ways, wrap around the lungs and the heart to kind of separate them so they have a little more freedom of movement. And when they are moving and expanding, they're not rubbing into each other, they're not rubbing into the bones that are protecting them, they're not rubbing into the aorta and the esophagus and other features inside the cavity. And that helps them be protected. It also helps them be encased in another little kind of watery bath or balloon that allows them to reduce their friction. All right? And so when we look at the thoracic cavity, there is a membrane that's going to create a space. So there's two membranes actually that are going to kind of like, one's a bag, a plastic bag, and that is touching the food, and another is a plastic bag that's double bagging. And imagine that little bit of space between the two plastic bags as a cavity. And for the lungs, we are going to create what's known as a pleural cavity. And so we are going to have a plastic bag around the innermost lung tissue, and that's going to be known as our visceral pleural membrane because it touches the lungs. And then we're going to have a parietal pleural membrane that is going to be a separate membrane attached to the rib cage, the costal cartilage, the sternum, that is going to then create a space between the visceral membrane and the parietal membrane that creates a pleural cavity. The heart is going to be the same way. You're going to have a part of the heart where it's going to be a visceral pericardial membrane, and that membrane is going to physically be touching the cardiomyocyte tissue that is the heart itself. But as that heart needs to move and expand, it doesn't want to touch and rub against the bones as well, or the lungs that are around it, the left lung. So there's going to be a parietal pericardial membrane. And there's a little bit of space between these two membranes that is going to be the pericardial cavity. And that pericardial cavity is where we're going to have a pericardial fluid. All right? Now, in the abdominal pelvic cavity, you are going to have really no bones. So you have some muscle, you have skin, but our stomach, when it's churning and mixing food, is not causing the muscles and the skin to move usually. And the muscle and the stomach, when it's churning and moving, is not making the colon move or in sync with it. There's a little bit of a physical separation. So what happens in the stomach doesn't necessarily cause problems in the large intestines or the small intestines. And we know our small intestines is like meters long. And again, little areas of the small intestines, as they are mixing and moving food within, are not then causing the areas sitting, anatomically speaking, next to it to then be, you know, deformed or pushed upon or mixed or messed with. And the way that that happens is because we have another peritoneal cavity. And like the pleural and the pericardial cavities, the peritoneal cavity is, again, a membrane that's kind of physically part of the internal visceral organ. And then there is a part of that cavity that's made because the outer membrane is touching the underlying hypodermis and fat that is then connected to the muscle and then the skin. And because of that little bit of space, what goes on in the organ is a little bit of physically divided from the rest of the organs that are around it. So that's what this is kind of showing you division-wise in a flow chart. And this is kind of showing you the picture in, again, that we have ventral cavities. The ventral cavity is divided into thoracic versus abdominal pelvic with our diaphragm dividing us. In the thoracic cavity, we have a right and a left lung, all right, and we have a heart. And these things are going to move. But in order to make sure that they don't rub up on the bones, rub up on each other, they are encased in a membrane that creates an outer wall and a membrane that touches the organ and creates an inner wall. And the space between them is the pericardial cavity for the heart, the pleural cavity for the lungs, or the peritoneal cavity for the abdominal pelvic region. And in doing that, the heart has a little bit of this fluid sac around it that lets it move and expand, and it doesn't rip it. It doesn't tear into the sternum. It doesn't tear into the right lung. It doesn't tear into the left lung. And that's what happens with the lungs. And each of them has their own pleural cavity. So there's two pleural cavities, one pericardial cavity, and then one big peritoneal cavity. Now, one thing to note is the peritoneal cavity does not go all the way to the bottom of the pelvic floor. And part of that is because eventually the urinary system wants to exit the body, so it doesn't want to be encased completely and have another layer and cavity to punch through. The colon needs to connect to the rectum and the anus, and again, it doesn't want to connect and push through another layer. So those membranes in the peritoneum are not going to actually sit and lie on the pelvic floor. Okay? So again, most of these membranes are going to be what we know is a serous membrane. They are going to make a little bit of fluid that is going to then be pushed into the cavity. The little bit of fluid that they make is a watery fluid, so that's why it's called a serous fluid. And then because it comes from the membrane, it's called a serous membrane. Again, we are going to have a membrane that's closer to the organ that is going to be physically touching the organ. So in the heart's case, might be physically part of what touches the cardiomyocytes and defines where they end and where the external layer of the heart begins. Same thing for the lungs, all right? So that is going to be the visceral layer, the visceral membrane. The outermost layer is going to be touching, in many cases, the bone, the fat, the hypodermis, the muscle that then goes outward towards superficially the skin. And that's going to be known as the parietal layer. And the space in between is the cavity. So when we talk about the space made by the parietal pleural membrane and the visceral pleural membrane, because it's the visceral parietal pleural membranes, they are going to create a pleural cavity. Okay? Now, not everything in the thoracic cavity is lung and heart. So the area that's kind of where the esophagus, the inferior and superior vena cava come into play, the aorta, and a little bit of fat and other material, that is going to be the mediastinum. Okay, and so again, in our picture back here, the mediastinum is this area that is not necessarily lung and heart tissue and all the other stuff, and it kind of gets squished into this little compartment of the thoracic cavity. Okay. In the abdominal pelvic cavity, again, the peritoneal cavity is created because of a parietal peritoneal membrane and a visceral peritoneal membrane. And this membrane creates this space, and that space is then what kind of helps protect the stomach from getting ripped as it's moving around by the pancreas or by the liver or by the transverse colon that sits all near it. Okay? Not everything in the abdominal pelvic cavity is surrounded by the visceral and parietal peritoneal membranes. So when things are outside of it, they will be outside the peritoneum space, and if they're towards the back part of the body, we can say they're retro, behind the peritoneum. And so the kidneys, the ureters, and part of the pancreas are considered retroperitoneum. Right? The pelvic floor, again, is going to be lined with muscle that helps with keeping our sphincters closed so we don't let out poop all the time and we don't let pee out constantly. Some of those muscles are going to play a role for being able to push poop and pee out or push babies out. So again, when we are letting those tubes exit or enter in the body, we don't necessarily want to have another cavity and another few layers of tissue to go through. And so the peritoneal cavity will end somewhat superior to where the pelvic cavity ends. And then that pelvic cavity will have a pelvic floor that will be made up of muscles that line the exits and entry points there. Okay. All right, so we have gotten to the end of Chapter 1. So at this time, again, review all of the terminology and the vocabulary. Learn it today because it comes up again for bones. It comes up again for muscles. It comes up again for organ system, vessels, neurons, nerves. And so if you can learn the terms and the vocabulary today, it'll help you in your job in the future if you stay in the human body, as well as the specific organs and locations and other names for things. Go back and review your levels of organization. Again, we're working from the chemistry level, the atom, to the organism level. We're not going subatomic. We're not going above organism. Homeostasis, be able to tell me what it is, how it helps maintain our stable environment. Most of the examples are negative feedback loops and how that works versus positive feedback loops occur a few small examples like birth and clotting and kind of how that works. And what we did today, our body cavities, our sections, our terminology that comes with it, our membranes that form the more specific little cavities around the heart, the lungs, and the abdominal pelvic organs. So that is Chapter 1. Again, you should have reviewed 2 videos for Chapter 1. You should be ready for lab. You should be looking forward to moving into Chapter 4, which will consist of a few more videos because there's a lot more content to cover in that chapter. All right, have a good day.